Hello, I'm Richard Adey. This is The Money. Today, we're looking at one of the business world's great success stories, something governments everywhere seem to want to emulate: the economic cluster. The City of London is one, a globally important hub for finance, insurance and capital markets. Silicon Valley is the most famous cluster of them all. But the most common cluster, the one you see all the time, isn't what we're talking about today. That's when car yards or fast food outlets or petrol stations turn up together. Why do they do that?
Well, there are a variety of reasons. One goes back to an interesting fellow who wrote an article for the Economic Journal in 1929, Harold Hotelling.
This is Roy Green, Dean of the UTS Business School,
who enunciated what became known as a principle of minimum differentiation. In other words, if you have products that are not differentiated, in other words, the same, then it's highly likely that you will cluster together so that you access what are seen as homogeneous consumer preferences. If you move away, for example, from the centre of the street to somewhere at the other end, you might feel that you would lose market share to someone who is in the middle and can attract consumers who don't really care about which retailer they attend to. And that even applies if there is some price differentiation.
So staying close to your competitor to keep an eye on them and get your share of the business. What we're looking at is bigger. Alan O'Connor is at the University of Adelaide's Entrepreneurship, Commercialisation and Innovation Centre.
A business cluster is a concentration of businesses that have earned themselves a reputation for a provision of excellence in a particular set of products and or services within a particular industry and maybe some related industry sectors around it. They're really defined in terms of their relatedness, both and their proximity and their specialisation.
There's more to it than that. They have to be economically successful.
That's the way we actually can identify them, is that they have earned that reputation, if you like, of success. And how that comes about is through a combination of competitiveness and collaboration. So you actually find that the firms are actually maybe competing in the same market spaces, but they actually collaborate at another level. And that may be in sharing things like resources such as machinery, the infrastructure that's in the place, knowledge or labour, for instance. And that gives them a competitive advantage in that sense. Another side of this is the way that knowledge is actually shared amongst the firms that are in the region or in the cluster. So you actually find that they advance fairly quickly because the knowledge itself is spread amongst the cluster fairly quickly.
But what do you need to see a modern cluster emerge? Richard Florida from the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto.
Well, this is the big question. And it seems to me, you can say you need a great university, and that's critical. And some people would say you need great transportation links. And certainly you need to be serviced by a great airport. But I think what you really need is to be in a place that other people like you want to be. And it really is talent and the clustering of talent that then attracts industry, then attracts all sorts of activity. And I mean, you see that as the economies moved from, a steel industry or aluminum industry economy or a shipping economy to a high-tech economy.
Talented people, he says, are the biggest attractor for other talented people.
What I find so fascinating is when you look at musicians. Musicians are incredibly highly clustered in places like London, England, or Los Angeles, or New York, or even Nashville, Tennessee. Extraordinarily clustered, one of the most clustered groups of any, more than software engineers or financial people or lawyers. And why? And it's really to be around other great musicians. So I think at the end of the day, that's what really makes a cluster great, being around other talented people who can enhance your own productivity and innovativeness. And out of that comes many great things.
You need something else too.
Above and beyond that, I think you need the leadership. And leadership doesn't just come in the government form either. Through the story of Silicon Valley, you see, it wasn't government who actually provided leadership in many parts. It was the university sector itself that actually took the lead on building a technological base in the region. So you need leadership not just at government, but certainly across the university sector and industry to step up.
We've already mentioned Silicon Valley. It's the biggest, richest, most successful cluster of the lot, and governments around the world have been fruitlessly trying to duplicate it for decades. But it didn't just emerge in the 70s. In the 19th century, it was farmland, and it was doing well.
There's a lot of railway infrastructure being put in, which actually creates wealth in that particular region. One of those entrepreneurs who built a railway empire was Leland Stanford. He created a university, Stanford University, in the region. And this is where another characteristic of the history of clusters comes in. It really comes down to people in some way as well. Leland Stanford had a vision for his university. He wanted to attract the brightest stars in a particular area. And interestingly, at that time, electricity was one of the emerging industries, and that's one of the things he wanted the university to focus on. Fast forward a little bit more, you have another person, Stanford professor Frederick Terman, who enters the scene and wants to actually grow the talent base in the region and actually looks to solve problems, if you like, with industry and create new company development in the region. So he encourages two people by the name of William Hewlett and Dave Packard. Hewlett-Packard. So it was the actions of Stanford, the history of Stanford, who actually got those types of companies going.
Hewlett-Packard's obviously important. What it leads to is more important.
Then you get Fairchild Semiconductors starting. Then you actually have another thing that comes along, which is really about the opportunities that are presented in the region. And at that time, you also had a space race going on. And NASA was pretty keen to actually outrun the Russians in the moon missions. So they looked to Fairchild, where this hotbed of talent was, to actually provide them high-powered electronics components. From the growth of that company, you start to spin off other companies. And today you have Intel, which was founded by Gordon Moore. So you see there's lots of things that have actually come together as a combination of both wealth, infrastructure, leadership, talent, and the opportunities which all accumulate and coincide over time.
So, Alan, apart from Silicon Valley, what are the other great clusters?
Think about Hollywood. That's a film-producing cluster. Or you might think about the Netherlands and the flour industry, which has now advanced into a more agricultural cluster, which really takes advantage of both its location and its infrastructure in the European region. You can also think about Korea and the ICT sector that happens there and that's sprung up around places or companies like Samsung and LG. In the UK, you can think about Cambridge as a cluster, leveraging its university and its strengths there, and or maybe Israel is another famous area where the defence industry and its propensity to revitalise its industry sector has drawn on that defence industry to create R&D concentration there. Or another one might be Singapore, where you think about the financial technologies that have taken place there.
What about here in Australia? What are ours?
One of the most famous ones I think you might be aware of course, is the Barossa Valley here in South Australia. Again, that is one that's emerged over time. It goes right back to the German immigration and the fact we had a non-convict settlement here, bringing in skilled labour into a fledgling colony. But at the same time, that winemaking now is almost bred into the genes of the region, if you like. The region has a highly active intermediary organisation, the Regional Development Australia Office in Tanunda, among a number of other supporting institutions, and has research centres from vine cultivation to production technologies. There are also funding mechanisms which are brought about through the wine equalisation tax, which is designed to create rebates to be reinvested in the industry, and is supported by universities and the talent pool through universities, with, for instance, the University of Adelaide providing specialist training and research. So we do have some clusters in Australia. There are also smaller ones or emerging ones that are happening. You could think about Port Lincoln in South Australia as a seafood cluster. You could also think about in the Blue Mountains, there's a creative industries cluster that's starting to blossom there. In Canberra, we have the Southeast Region of Renewable Energy Excellence, which is trying to bring together the industry from that region. And then you also have Marine and Shipbuilding Cluster in Henderson, Western Australia. Another example is Ultimo in Sydney, where the University of Technology Sydney is based. And what they are doing is bringing together a cluster of creative technology sectors.
Roy Green's UTS Business School sits in the heart of that cluster.
Here in Ultimo, Haymarket, Surrey Hills area. We have what we call a digital creative cluster or precinct. That's based very largely around digital and Internet of Things, machine learning and so on. In Western Sydney, we have a number of nodes of advanced manufacturing, some of which is as competitive as anything one would find anywhere in the world. We don't hear much about it. It's below the radar because many of the firms are quite small, but they're plugged into global markets and value chains. Northern Sydney, we have the growing medtech cluster near Macquarie University, some homegrown companies, Cochlear, ResMed, but also large international ones. In the centre of the city, financial services and fintech, the disruptive digital developments that are going to change the face of finance. We're very good at that. And we're seeing new developments out in Westmead, the health precinct, the possibility of a new science park near Sydney's second airport. There's a huge amount of interest here and around the world in the growth of these concentrated geographical phenomena.
The only one for me is you, and you for me, so happy together.
This is The Money on RN, the ABC Radio app, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Richard Adey. Today we're looking at business clusters. And here, just like everywhere else, life isn't fair. Richard, Florida.
I've increasingly come to conclude that our cities are really part of what I call winner-take-all urbanism, that the already big and successful are getting more successful. I mean, Tom Friedman long ago told us that the world is flat, that the world is becoming more global, that more places are plugging and playing. You know, I've come to believe that the world is spiky and becoming spikier.
His research shows that just as entertainment and sporting superstars are given more and more and more, it's the same with cities and clusters.
One, if you look over the course of the past 25 years, the San Francisco Bay Area proper has increased its share of venture capital-backed startups from about a fifth to nearly a half, so more than doubled its share. But what are the other places that have been able to increase their performance? It's not the small little office park clusters in the suburbs. In fact, in the Bay Area, which I mentioned, San Francisco proper, the city, the urban center of San Francisco, now has about 3 times the venture capital startups as the actual Silicon Valley in San Jose and Sunnyvale does. So it's really shifted. You know, it's moved from the suburban office parks of the Silicon Valley proper to the urban quarters of San Francisco. But the other places that have increased their ability to generate venture capital-backed entrepreneurial startups are Lower Manhattan in New York City and Greater London. So what's interesting is these superstar cities, if you will, these large, big, productive, agglomerated clusters of cities have added to finance and entertainment and media an incredible cluster of tech-based industries.
There's a but coming, isn't there?
That doesn't mean that a small place like a Nashville, like many cities in Australia, it can't prosper. Pittsburgh, where I lived for nearly 17 years, you know, it declined based on steel, but it's now becoming a center for self-driving vehicles. But you really have to do something quite different. You know, you can't try to emulate the best of the best. You have to pick something that's quite different. And you really have to make your offer what's special about you. Pittsburgh realized what's special about Pittsburgh. It's an industrial town. It doesn't have beaches. It doesn't have great weather. It has a kind of industrial aesthetic. So I think it's figuring out what is attractive about your city to talent and what are the unique things you could do that maybe no one else does. And certainly I think you're beating your head up against a wall if you're trying to go against the best of the best in this kind of winner-take-all urban system that we have evolved.
So if you're not a superstar city, you stay in your weight division. You get the right people, choose the right niche, and boom, competitive advantage.
It might be based on a history of skill development or former industries, but it is something we create for ourselves. And a good example of that, and one I visited a couple of years ago, is in southwest Germany, around a very small village called Schwenningen, which was the centre of the clockmaking area in the 18th, 19th centuries. Clockmaking disappeared, and I guess they went through a challenging industrial transition, but now they're the world's leading producers and suppliers of surgical instruments. really in the middle of nowhere next to the Black Forest, just a handful of villages with a very fine technology university called Hochschule Furtwangen University. It supplies the talent. The managers of the local companies teach in the university. The students do internships and get experience in the companies, and they sometimes go away and come back, but they form a tight-knit group of communities and families who run those companies, and they benchmark themselves against the best in the world.
You're an educator, Roy, but how crucial is a university to a cluster?
I could almost say that a cluster in an area featuring new technologies and skills cannot exist without a significant contribution by a higher education institution, whether a university or a technical institute. And this is demonstrated by research and experience around the world. And that goes for places that undergo significant renewal. And I would take as an example there Massachusetts, which in the 1980s and 90s went through a process of deindustrialization. Very few people remember now that that was described as the Rust Belt of America, along with other places that remain so. But Massachusetts reinvented itself. It was formerly known as a Wang economy, named after computer hardware suppliers that went offshore, left it with 15% unemployment, and it had to reinvent itself. And of course it has some of the finest universities in the world, MIT and Harvard among them. And with that depth of skill, research and commitment to innovation and to scientific expertise, they reinvented themselves as an economy based around medical technologies and biosciences. And now Boston is really the centre of an innovation ecosystem featuring some of the major companies in the world in this space.
And Carnegie Mellon University turns out to be just as central to Pittsburgh.
As a talent magnet, having a great university like an MIT, like a Stanford, and I do believe that Carnegie Mellon, it's smaller than those places, but in terms of electrical and computer engineering and robotics and self-driving vehicles, it's as good. It's smaller in scale. So I do think, that having a great technical university like that is really a hub or anchor institution of the knowledge economy. And really, that's why Pittsburgh is so different than so many other Rust Belt towns, because it really had nurtured a really, really spectacular technical and scientific university.
Macquarie University in Sydney's northern suburbs is taking all this to heart. The uni has lots of green space and one day plans to have rather less. The hope is to attract businesses that would fit with Macquarie's research strengths, like hearing. The Australian Hearing Hub is on campus, and right in the middle of it is Macquarie's Director of Hearing Research, David McAlpine.
The Hearing Hub has a number of Macquarie University departments. It has Cochlear, as well as Cochlear's world headquarters across the road. It has a number of charity organisations, the Royal Institute for Deaf and Blind Children, the Shepherd Centre, another charity organisation. Importantly, it also has Australian Hearing, which is the government's hearing services agency, and its research centre, the National Acoustic Laboratories.
The thinking is that putting them all together generates advantages for each, and a lot of the benefit comes from being physically close.
I think geography is really important. We're social animals, and we're social media animals, we think, but actually we really do connect when we actually meet each other. And all of the social interactions that are important, not just in the field, in my own field of hearing sciences and deafness research, we know that communication is more than just speaking. It's the interaction, it's the trust, it's the engagement, it's the visual cues. And I think a proximity thing is important. You need to be able to speak to people, you need to understand their own relationships that they have with others and in their own organisations, and just being able to have a cup of coffee with people is really important. Those are, we say it almost glibly, but those coffee meetings and corridor meetings are essentially critical to engagement at a level that is not just formalised and sitting around the meeting table. It's actually the breaking down of barriers. And breaking down of barriers has a strong geographical need for proximity.
What are the challenges, David?
I think the challenges of working across big organisations are the same challenges as working within big organisations. We know there's a lot of as some people have called it, treacle in organisations that slows things down, that slows down our working, whether it's because of legal issues or we have a range of different demands, education, research, pastoral care, all of those aspects in a university. And then you look at it in Cochlear. They've got marketing to do, they've got competitors, they've got a lot of regulation to go through, they've got clinical deadlines, and they've got funding issues associated with whether the government or a provider pays for the sort of therapies they're providing. So all of those issues mean that we're all working to try and solve them within our organisations. The challenge is to step out of that and say, let's work slightly differently. Let's look at what, for example, what does Cochlear need? What's the collaborative research that joins the strengths of the university, say in manufacturing with 3D printing, which is a big strength here? And how does that fit onto what Cochlear actually need? Do they have to go to another country or another university to do that? Can they do that locally in a relationship way that develops the sort of product, maybe, but also a research funding profile that together we get much more out of it than individually? It's the relationship, though, developing that, which takes time, and that we're, I guess, at the Hearing Hub, maybe more advanced than other places.
Universities understand their importance in clusters and realise this presents them with opportunities. But Macquarie has the land to make it happen, and it's leading the way.
Bringing a company and the headquarters of a company onto a university campus was a brave move. I'd never seen anything like it, and when I arrived in Sydney for the interview for the role I'm currently in, and then I saw not only the Australian Hearing Hub, but Cochlear's headquarters 100 metres away. I thought, this is different. This has got an opportunity to do something different. But it takes time. You can't just put two large, culturally different organisations with crossed over but still different drivers together and expect everything just to happen. You've got to build the relationships and understand where the contact points are actually going to be most effective.
You've heard what universities can do. What can governments do? Roy Green.
Government, I would see as an enabler rather than a prescriber in this space. It's very difficult for these clusters to grow and be successful if government isn't involved in some ways. The government has a strategy around its National Innovation and Science Agenda that is at last paying some attention to the growth of local clusters and innovation ecosystems. We ignore them at our peril because they're very hard to create, they're easy to destroy. And if you, in an area, decide to replace emerging entrepreneurial activity with residential apartment blocks, for example, you've killed the prospect of an innovation ecosystem or precinct. Government, however, can provide the trigger for such things to emerge and to be successful through the provision of space. That's just so important. A good example, for example, is in Paris. Station F is a newly created precinct to provide space for incubators, accelerators, co-working spaces, and connecting them up to research institutions. Those are essential ingredients of clustering. But there's also the soft infrastructure as well. How do you encourage the network brokers who can bring people together, bring, say, students or academics or other entrepreneurs together with venture capital? How do you connect such new ventures to global markets, which the entrepreneurs may have little idea about?
Alan O'Connor says some of the most successful clusters have a facilitating organisation, which the government funds.
For instance, in Singapore, we can talk about A-STAR, which is a government agency that is actually there supporting industry and investment in particular areas. In the Basque Country, they have established Orchestra, the Basque Competitiveness Institute. And both of these agencies act as intermediaries to assist firms and governments. They're working between firms and governments and universities to really focus on demand issues and developing the ways and means of regional collaboration to increase the competitiveness of the region.
But Richard Florida says getting a cluster to grow and thrive is only doing half the job.
I think that if you just build a successful urban economic cluster, you will get more inequality, more division, more economic segmentation. Well, my research shows it. The bigger, the denser, the more knowledge intensive, the more innovative a city or metropolitan area is, the more unequal it is, the more segregated it is, and the more unaffordable it is.
So what can be done about that? Well, it depends where you are.
What fits in Sydney is different than what fits in Melbourne. What fits in Melbourne is different than what fits Brisbane. What fits Adelaide or Perth is different than those. So I think a couple things. One, we just have to get with building more urban housing. We have to overcome this not in my backyard or NIMBY spirit that says, I don't want new housing built next to me. We have to, of course, invest in more transit and high-speed rail. You know, what makes New York a great city, what makes a London a great city is that they could scale to over 10 or 20 million people. Well, they did that not based on cars and driving about, but based on old but functional transit systems and subways. We have to connect our great cities that are far apart, particularly in the Australian context, with faster rail so we can make them part of one giant mega region. And in addition to that, I think one of the things we have to do is create a new group of family-supporting middle-class jobs. You know, the old middle-class family-supporting jobs were the jobs for the working-class people in factories. My dad had one of those jobs. Now the new blue-collar job is working in a retail shop or a hospitality company or in the caring professions or in a hotel or a tourist agency, food preparation and service in a restaurant. So those jobs pay terribly, and you know, so did manufacturing jobs 100 years ago, but we decided that the people who worked in factories had to become middle class so that they can buy cars and the stuff our factories were being produced. We have to do the same with service jobs, and we have to make them better jobs.
This is bigger, much bigger, than innovation and proximity driving economic success. But Richard Florida says it has to be.
If we just focus on building more innovative, more entrepreneurial, stronger knowledge and talent and technology clusters, the end result of that is an increasingly divided city. And that's bad enough. What's worse, I think, is that creates the kind of backlash, that creates the kind of political backlash that leads to the election of a populist character like Donald Trump, whose then political agenda becomes to kind of tear down the very urban fabric that drives innovation and economic growth and undermines prosperity. I call this the great political contradiction of modern capitalism.
Richard Florida is at the University of Toronto and author of The New Urban Crisis. You also heard from Alan O'Connor from the Entrepreneurship, Commercialisation and Innovation Centre at the University of Adelaide, Dean of the UTS Business School, Roy Green, and Macquarie University's Director of Hearing Research, David McAlpine. You'll find details on our homepage at abc.net.au/rn. The Money is produced by Kate Piercy. Our sound engineer is Bella Tropiano. And I'm Richard Adey.
Together.